During our Sunday night times together through this month of June, we want to be studying the book of Jonah. So if you have your Bibles, you might want to open it up to Jonah chapter 1. And we'll also be having not only these videos, kind of me relating a simple story and lesson, if you will, but then there will also be times for discussion that you and your group can share together with that. You know, the story of Jonah is one nearly everyone knows, from little children to adults. It's not the typical fish story about the one that got away, but rather it's the story about the man that did not get away. You know, the Old Testament book of Jonah only has 4 chapters, but they are filled with action, suspense, and drama. It's also a book that is very controversial. But we're not going to get into a discussion of the book's history or controversy. We want to look at its message, and especially its message to us. Let me just say that as far as the historicity of the book is concerned, Jesus thought it was real and historical. Listen to what he says in Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." You know, they didn't question that. They knew the story. And Jesus says it is real and historical. So besides being true and historical, I believe the book of Jonah is also a picture portrayal of God's love and pursuit of his human creation, us, you and me. It's a picture of our refusal of him and then even our ultimate surrender to him. In one sense, it portrays 4 different reactions we may have to God's desire to be in our lives. Like Jonah, we can run from God, we can run to God, we can run with God, and sometimes we can run ahead of God. So tonight, let's start by looking at how we run from God. Jonah's call is very simply stated as the opening verses of Jonah chapter 1. It says there, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." You know, the estimated date of all of this is about 750 BC. At that time, Assyria was the world power, and Nineveh was its capital. The Syrians had subjugated and tormented the northern tribes of Israel for years, killing them, selling them into slavery, and generally terrorizing the Jewish inhabitants of the land. History records the Assyrians as being some of the most cruel and barbaric people regarding their treatment of prisoners of war. And yet in about 30 years, these Assyrians would then come and take all of these Israelites out of their land and into captivity, as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 5 through 6. And yet, at this point, God's call to Jonah was very simple. Go to Nineveh and preach. And Jonah, being a prophet of God, hears that, and what is his response? Verse 3 says, Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Jonah heads south from his area of Galilee in the north, and goes down to Joppa. Now, Joppa, according to the maps, are about 500 miles from Nineveh. And there he buys a ticket to a place called Tarshish. Generally, scholars place this location east of the Strait of Gibraltar in modern-day Spain, roughly 2,500 miles from Joppa and 3,000 miles from Nineveh. So Jonah was headed as far as he could get away from Nineveh. And you don't have to wonder why. Because the text says it very plainly in verse 3, to flee from the presence of the Lord. We could speculate all day about Jonah's motives or his fears, but it simply boils down to his running away from the task God had for him. But the rest of the story is chapter 1. In verses 4 and 5, we find that the Lord hurled a great storm on the sea, a storm of wind on the sea. There was a great storm so that the ship was about to break up. And that causes great fear among the sailors. The sailors then put together a plan. Here's how we're going to save the ship. And in verse 5 it says they began to ditch the cargo, throwing everything overboard to lighten the ship. But when that didn't work, they came to another plan. Well, let's find out whose fault it was. You see, they thought everything was cause and effect. Somebody did something wrong, and therefore we're being punished for it. And so their plan was to find out who it was. And the lot was cast, and it came and fell on Jonah. Now, we also find in these verses that Jonah had to be awakened by the captain to come on deck and start praying just like everybody else was. But then once the lot fell on Jonah, Jonah has a plan. Jonah's plan to save the ship is stated in verse 12. Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and then the sea will become calm for you. Well, that really wasn't what the sailors had in mind. They really didn't want to lose anybody. They didn't want to throw Jonah overboard, even though the lot had fallen to him, and they figured it was his fault. But ultimately, they did. And the result, according to verse 15, they picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. So the storm stopped. But there was another result. It says in verse 17 that the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so we know how all of that transpires. But once we know all of that, we need to ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from this? What are the things that God is trying to teach us out of this chapter? First of all, let me suggest that one of those lessons we ought to learn is that God has a plan for each of us, just as He had a plan for Jonah. We're probably familiar with the passage from Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11, when God has the prophet write back to the captives of Israel in Babylon, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. He had a plan for them as to what was going to happen. The wise man of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, says it this way, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. God has a plan set for us. In Psalm 139, David says that your eyes, when he speaks about God and what God was doing, he said, your eyes have seen my unformed substance. And in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. God had a plan even before David was born, even before you and I were born. Even as he tells Jeremiah the prophet in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 5 that before I formed you in the womb I knew you, and before you were born I consecrated you. You see, God has a plan for us. We might also recognize that when we become Christians, God has a plan for us. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, it says simply this, that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. God has a plan for each of us. And yet, when we run from God, because we do have that choice, just like Jonah did, when we run from God and what He has for us, He will pursue us with discipline. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 6, we do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by Him, for those whom He loves, He disciplines. Now, this discipline is not the punishment brought on by God's anger, like a lot of people think about it. Sometimes it's simply the consequences of our actions. That's what happens to us. However, in this instance, I believe it's safe to say that it is likely that God did bring about the storm, forcing Jonah to admit publicly his running away from God. But yet also in this, when we recognize God punishing or disciplining us, rather, through our actions and the consequences to those actions, we ought to also learn that our disobedience may affect and does many times affect others. Just as Jonah's disobedience not only affected him, it affected everyone on that ship that he was aboard. So when we run from God, He will pursue us with discipline to teach us that lesson. And although we run from God, He does provide a way back. I'm sure that Jonah knew what was going on and why. He knew that God had sent this storm. He knew that he had run from God and God was trying to catch up to him. Because in verse 12 he said, I know that on account of me this great storm has come upon you. Jonah knew what he was doing. He knew that God was also coming after him. And I'm sure that even though Jonah had said, throw me into the sea, and when the sailors ultimately picked him up and pitched him overboard, that Jonah was thinking, this has got to be the end. This is all there is. He had asked to be thrown into the sea, almost as if he knew that the giving of his life would save the life of those on board. However, as Jonah hits the water, God appoints a great fish to swallow him up. We know Jonah is going to be given a second chance because God provided it. Jonah had run from God, and yet God was going to give him an opportunity to do what needed to be done. Maybe that's another great lesson we could learn. We cannot outrun God. Neither can we outrun the love of God. When we run from Him, He pursues us. He disciplines us. But He always has a way for us to find our way back. A contemporary Christian artist by the name of Jordan Felice tells us in his song, Never Too Far Gone, speaking the words of God, I have loved you from the start. There's no distance too far that I can't reach you. There's no place so dark that I can't find you. You will never outrun my love. Some great lessons we can learn from Jonah as he tries to run from God. And yet, this is only the beginning of our journey together as we go through this book of Jonah. So take this time now to discuss these lessons and the things that you might take from Jonah chapter 1.